Alex, are you there?
I am here. Hello, John.
Hey, how are you? Let me just introduce myself and then you, and then I'll ask you a few questions. So I am John Horgan. I'm a science journalist who also teaches at Stevens Institute of Technology and something called the College of Arts and Letters. And with me is one of my colleagues, Professor Alex Wellerstein, who is an historian of science or technology or both?
All of the above.
All of the above. Okay, so my first question for you, and the point of these videos is to tell the world, and especially prospective students, who we are at Stevens, who we are at the College of Arts and Letters. And so you're an historian of science/technology. Why? How did you end up becoming that? I'm curious.
I'm the kind of person who finds science and technology very interesting, but I don't want to actually do science, and I don't want to make technology for the most part. And so what I was interested in, I got interested in history as an undergraduate. Initially, I didn't think I was that interested in history, because history, as you learn it, especially in high school, is a lot of memorization. It's like names and dates and things that are just seem to have no interest to anybody, like Jacksonian tax policy and things like that. And there are some people who are interested in that, but I wasn't. When I went to college, I found that history is actually this sort of this contested ground. It's a thing that people argue about. It's not just a list of facts of what happened, but it's a question of how you tell the story of what happened and whose stories and with what evidence and things like that. And so I got really interested in it. I thought it was powerful. I then stumbled across this very strange field called the history of science and technology, which I had never heard of before, and most people have not heard of if they haven't been in academia in some way. And it's looking at how science and technology developed over time. And to me, this was very interesting because it combined my interest in history and these sort of stories that motivate us and have power to them with science and technology, which are interesting, and also these sort of powerful forces in the world. And then also the history of science for me is an interesting way to look at what might otherwise seem like a philosophical question. How is knowledge made? How do you know if it's true? How far can you get with a bad theory about the world? Things like that. The history of science sort of says you don't have to imagine the answers. If you look far enough in history, you'll find somebody who did exactly this. And so I thought it captured a lot of my interests in a very unusual way. And I started taking classes in it, and I started studying it, and I eventually got a PhD in it. And here I am still doing it. So the answer is it's the most fascinating field that nobody's ever heard about.
Well, you're making it more famous because of the research that you've done, particularly on nuclear weapons. You're not the kind of person who brags, so I'll brag on your behalf. I think it's fair to say that you are one of the world's leading experts on the history of nuclear weapons. You do a lot of writing. You're quoted as an expert in media all the time. How did you get interested in that particular topic?
This still goes back to even when I was an undergraduate, I was drawn to places where science was used. So you have these people who are sitting in the laboratory and sitting with their machines and their, vials or whatever your stereotype of a scientific work might be. And they're trying to learn about how the world works, right? But then you have these other people, say in government, in the military, who want to sort of see if you know how the world works, can you use it? Can you operationalize it? And so I got interested in a number of topics along these lines, and nuclear weapons was one of them. It was sort of the big topic in which science, in this case, what was at the time regarded as a very abstract and pointless science, which is to say theoretical physics, went from being an interesting intellectual exercise to being the thing that would determine the entire international order. And it did that in the tiniest of time spans, 5 years or so. And that has always been fascinating to me. it's also been the case that when you add nuclear weapons to anything, you're adding a sort of existential risk, dread. You're adding the possibility of at the very least mass casualties, and maybe at the most mass extinction. And so questions that might be interesting in a sort of general scientific sense become sort of extremely important when you talk about them in nuclear weapons for the real world. So for example, my recent book, which is coming out pretty soon, is on secrecy in nuclear weapons. And I spent a lot of time learning about how secrecy worked in this context. And if you're a historian of science, secrecy comes up all the time. Galileo kept secrets. Newton didn't tell anybody about half of his work, things like that. Darwin didn't write about his book at all until he finally did, and things like that. In nuclear weapons case, you're applying secrecy to an entire field, many fields of scientific and technological development, and trying to enforce that at both national and international levels, with the consequences of failure being potentially, national destruction and things like that. So nuclear weapons sort of turn things up to 11, to use the old Spinal Tap reference. And so that's one of the reasons I've been interested in it. It's one of those topics that also, when I talk to advisors about wanting to study the history of nuclear weapons, many of them, especially nuclear secrecy, many of them would say things like, are there enough sources for that? Aren't they secret? Isn't a lot of that classified? And the answer is, yeah, a lot of it's classified. But one, there's more out there than people realize. If you're a historian, you learn how to find these things and where they are and how to read between the lines. And two, it makes the whole enterprise, being a historian is already kind of like a detective game where you're like looking for the evidence and looking for the clues and trying to construct what happened. But when you add the fact that it's the government is trying to keep you from learning those clues, it makes it even more fun. So I'm also quite fond of the detective-y aspect of doing it, and nuclear weapons make the entire thing a detective game. It's really satisfying when you sort of feel like you pulled out some meaning from these files that are all blacked out and then turn it into some sort of coherent understanding of what happened in the past.
So I must say, pretty much every single time I talk to you and you're talking about the history of nuclear weapons or even things that are going on today, you're telling me things I don't know. And I've written about nuclear weapons since the early 80s when I first became a science and technology writer myself. To what extent are your research interests driven by things that are happening today? The things that you write about, the things that you investigate as a scholar, and so forth?
It's a mix. It usually is a mix. And I think this is fair to say of most historians too. You have part of you that is interested in the history qua history, and you're interested in resurrecting some moment that's really not here in the present and getting inside the head of a person who's been dead for 50 years and learning how they think without any worries about whether that will be relevant today. And in fact, I'm always interested in lines of thought that sort of go dead, right? Where people thought up to a certain point that this might be the answer, and then today it's unthinkable. Nobody would ever suggest that as a possibility for various reasons. I find those really interesting because they show you sort of the conditions of possibility and things like that. On the other hand, it's impossible, especially when you're doing a topic that does intersect with present day issues, that intersects sometimes scarily with them when it comes to nuclear arms and brinksmanship and even secrecy, things like that. It's impossible not to feel that that's an influence into what you're interested in and even affects how you look at the past. And historians are okay with that. We don't pretend to be totally objective. We don't actually think it's probably possible to be disconnected from your present, but we try not to let that sort of be in the driver's seat. But just as an example, one of the topics I've been working on a lot over the last few years has been about the origins of our system in which the president makes the decisions to use nuclear weapons. And I've been looking very closely at the Truman administration, which is where that system gets put in place at the first time, and looking at when they put it in place and how and why, and sort of how it got challenged within the government and on what basis. And that is a historical inquiry, but it's also motivated by our present world. There's been a lot of people discussing this question of who should have their finger on the button, so to speak. Should the president have all that power? Should another person have that power? Why or why not? And so that's a historical question that is deliberately meant to inform a present issue, and is perhaps motivated by a present issue, though you still go into it not knowing what you're going to find and not expecting things to work out as you first imagined they might.
To what extent, I mean, nuclear weapons is a really contested topic. Should we have them at all? Should we get rid of them? How should they be controlled? To what extent, as a scholar, do you find yourself being drawn to certain positions? Do you ever have to resist being an activist? Do you feel as though that is something that you should resist?
I was always taught that this is tricky, and scholars will argue about this amongst themselves, but I was always taught that if you don't want to be primarily an activist as a scholar, you can be an activist on your own time, you can be an activist some other time, but if your scholarship is just a form of activism, then it's probably not a great form of scholarship. Now, there's people who debate that and ask, well, could you separate that? And is being sort of a pretending to be neutral on an issue in which no one can be neutral, is that not a form of sort of political speech by itself? I've tried to always resist being a sort of simplistic activist. I don't really suspect, and this is, I think my scholarship has, and study of history has driven me to this position. I'm very suspicious of easy answers. I'm very suspicious of, oh, if we got rid of this one thing, the world would be great. Or if we adopted this one thing, the world would be great. In my experience, that's never been the case. It's unlikely to be the case. And I'm also very adept at seeing other people's points of view, which as a historian you have to do, because you're going to be reading a lot of people who you disagree with. And if you just disagreed with everybody you read in the past, you wouldn't get very far as a historian. And so I find it pretty hard usually to come up with a simple activist position. I have over the years, though, in talking with lots of people and seeing lots of points of views and watching history unfold in my lifetime and learning more, found that I do gravitate towards certain positions. They're not usually the ones people expect, and sometimes they disappoint people. Some people want me to be much more strongly anti-nuclear weapons than I am. Some people want me to be more pro-nuclear weapons than I am, and I'm always sort of can see both sides and sort of, answer the way academics do, which is to say long and equivocating. But I have over time built up stronger and stronger convictions, but they're not usually on sort of simple left versus right sorts of issues. They're on questions like, when do the ends justify the means? Do they ever, right? Should you be suspicious of that kind of logic if it leads you to kill tens of thousands of people, much less more? What kind of benefits would be worth that? Those kinds of questions I found myself shifting in different directions on over the years, the more I study it.
Yeah, I must say that you have, I'm sort of an old anti-war peacenik, and, going back to the Vietnam War, which was still being waged when I was a kid. And, I would like to see a world without nuclear weapons, and you have complicated my own views by giving me so much information. Let me ask you kind of a related question. How do you feel about, as a scholar, about communicating with the public as opposed to other scholars?
I think that, I'm not saying that every scholar should communicate with the public, because some are terrible at it, and that's fine. There's a whole wide world of scholars who should just be doing scholarship for other scholars, because that gets us somewhere, that's valuable. However, I do think that scholars who are interested in communicating with the public, and especially if they turn out to be good at communicating with the public, should use their position and their knowledge as a way to not only sort of raise the public understanding and discourse around a given topic, but also be a model of what it is to be an expert. Because we live in a world in which expertise is pretty contentious, in which people have their ideas about what it means to be a professor or an egghead or any of these things. And I think there's space for being an expert who can, again, show that you can look at both sides of an issue, that can still look at both sides of an issue, but still conclude one of them is more right than the other, and present evidence in a way that doesn't assume that your audience is stupid, for example. So these kinds of things I do quite a lot. And so in my own work, this manifests in a couple different ways. I do write articles aimed at popular audiences. I've written for the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Harper's. Those are pretty educated popular audiences, but there you go. And I've appeared on television shows, some of which pitched at a very broad audience, like for the History Channel, but also those pitched at sort of the more like NPR crowd. And then also the biggest impact I probably had on both as a scholar and as a public communicator has been my website, the Nuke Map, which is a nuclear weapons effects simulator that anyone can view if they type in Nuke Map into Google. And that's been used by, I haven't checked recently, but probably 30 million people since it's been online globally. Every country in the world, including North Korea and Iran, have used the Nuke Map to some degree. And that's, for me, a nice model of the kind of public communication, some of it that I like to do, in that it doesn't tell you what to think. It doesn't even tell you what to do. It just says, if you want to simulate a nuclear weapon, pick your nuclear weapon, pick where you want it, and choose how you want it to go off, and then you'll see what the consequences are. And it sort of encourages people to learn on their own and to try things out and to come to conclusions. And I like that a lot, because I feel like you're putting the tools of learning into the hands of the public. You're not forcing them into their hands, but it can be useful for all sorts of different types of questions you might ask, either historically, present day, and people use it all over the world in different ways, and journalists use it as well. And so I'm, for telling stories about nuclear weapons as well. So this kind of thing to me is a nice example of, and certainly a self-serving one, but a nice example of what scholarship can do for this kind of public outreach. It requires a lot of expert information, but also turns it into a form that's very usable and digestible.
Yeah, I love Nuke Map. It freaks me out, but I mean, that's kind of the point. You also, in addition to teaching classes in the history of nuclear weapons, and I think you teach a class in eugenics, or you used to, you also teach classes in communication and how to use graphics, right? And how to do, well, you teach a class called science communication, I guess, as well. Is that right?
The class I teach is called Visualizing Society.
Visualizing Society. So how important do you see that as a sort of part of what you do at Stevens?
I find it really fun. One, I'm glad Stevens lets me teach this crazy class, but I think the students like it as well. It's very, well-liked class. But it sums up a lot of what I think a place like Stevens and the College of Arts and Letters can do really well. So Visualizing Society is a course that is sort of half data visualization and sort of public communication, and half of it is sort of what we would call science studies, which is thinking deeply about what data really is, thinking about how communication really works, things like that. And then what it tries to do is mash up a lot of theory about how these things work with the actual practice of making things. So all of my students end up building basically websites that are data-driven and interactive. So you're building things kind of like the Nuke Map sometimes, though for different topics. And the students pick their own topics. Sometimes it's on extinctions, sometimes it's on crime, whatever it might be. They research the topic and find it or build the data sets, and then find innovative ways to sort of display it. To me, this is what the College of Arts and Letters is about. It's one part serious, looking at the world and humanistic questions and issues. What kinds of things matter? How do you communicate those things? What should be communicated? Things of that nature. It's one part sort of using technology to sort of heighten those things, not in competition in any way, but sort of as a hybrid entity. And in three, it's a lot of fun. And to me, not that all of life is fun, But I do think that this kind of stuff can be a lot more fun than people realize. And I think that embodying the fun is an important role in sort of modeling what it means to be an educated person, because that's why I do what I do. If I wasn't having fun with my research or my, job, I would do something else.
Yeah, I've learned over the years that if I'm having fun in a classroom, it's more likely that the students, it doesn't mean that the students will be having fun, but it's more likely that the students will be enjoying themselves. Those are pretty much all the questions I wanted to ask you, Alex. So it's great talking to you, and I hope I'll be seeing you on campus sometime soon.
Hopefully so. Good to talk with you, John. Thanks a bunch.
Same here.